Our contact details are on the website and our Facebook page. Now to introduce Alison Pennington. Alison Pennington is Senior Economist with the Centre for Future Work, a public commentator and writer. She conducts research on economic issues facing working people, including the evolution of collective bargaining and the role of government. Alison completed a Master of Political Economy from the University of Sydney, where her research focus was on the Australian finance system, housing and inequality. Alison has written for the Centre for Future Work on the evolution of collective bargaining, future skills and labour market policies. In previous roles, she was a union organiser in the CPSU, public finance and foreign affairs policy for the Commonwealth Government, and a public school music teacher. She considers economics a powerful tool for reinvigorating ideas about how society is organised and for building a more democratic and meaningful life for everybody and for everyday people. She will talk in this Zoom forum on the state of the crisis as it is currently unfolding, her recent articles, How the Government is Turning Back the Clock for Women, published in the New Daily, and Why Governments Must Spend to Save the Australian Economy, from the Newcastle Herald, as well as the broader questions of the prospects for workers during the recession and what should be the policy and strategic priorities in response. So Alison, thank you for being with us tonight, and over to you.
Thank you. Well, the bio sounds quite involved, didn't it? Thanks everyone for joining me. I'm particularly thankful because I'm in lockdown here in Melbourne, and I appreciate being able to connect with people and chat with people. And thank you for taking the time to join me. I am going to go out on a limb and just talk about stuff that's had my brain spinning for the last 48 hours. So I'm going to be taking a few risks. I don't have, lots of hard numbers on the back end of the presentation, but it's a strong feeling and a hint that I have, and I hope that it at least gets people's brains going and, starts a conversation that goes beyond me. So I've got some slides for you guys to follow with me, and I'll just share them with you now. But the presentation will cover what the renewed war on wages and workers' rights looks like in the COVID period, and how it is that I think by Labor, that's OUR, seizing a public health agenda can enable us to improve the quality of work, the pay and the quality of work, in particular, slaying the precarious work dragon, and how it is that by improving the quality of work, we can actually expand the space that is held by public sector imperatives and diminish the space held by private interests in particularly essential services. So that's kind of my what I've come to in the 5 minutes before I've logged on. I think it's going to work. So let's get going. So it's not going to be news to anyone here that we are facing a pretty significant economic event. Just to give you a little indication of what it meant for a contraction in the 1990 recession, we're looking at a 10% GDP collapse in the June quarter coming up alone, on top of the +10 we've already had. So the unique nature, speed and depth of this crisis and this contraction is like nothing we've seen before. So whole parts of the economy were shut down, all the customer facing sectors which had higher contagion risk. And of course, we lament the state of those sectors, there's a big spillover effects that come from those. So you imagine if we've got retail shop fronts that are closing, at some point the wholesale links in the supply chain begin to change their orders, and then suddenly manufacturers are producing less stuff, and you can see how the spillover effect doesn't just start with the loss of those customer facing sectors. But broader supply chains have been disrupted, particularly for a country like Australia, which is very trade exposed. What we can expect and what we're seeing is massive jobs shed. We could lose 2 to 3 million jobs, maybe more. Women and young workers have been the most affected, and that's particularly because they predominate in insecure and those front customer-facing services work. Immediate loss of incomes for workers, families, businesses and organisations. which has forced people to stop spending, which then leads to further job cuts. And this really is an unprecedented moment in history. And the key task for progressives is to work out, how do we stop this from becoming a depression? Because this is not banal market forces that we are waiting while we don't sit on our hands and wait for the private sector to decide to invest. They are quite clearly cutting their losses and running. And we don't want to be back in a position that we did in the 1930s, where for 10 years we listened to people tell us that we were going to wait for this business-led recovery that never came. And we had long-term high unemployment and high levels of destitution, and it took us the 1940s for us to recover. So the new jobs figures that came out today showed that official unemployment increased slightly. It's at 992,000 people. That's official unemployment. That's people who are applying and part of the job seeker process. But then if we add on those who worked, were classified as employed but worked no hours, and then those who worked far fewer hours than normal, that's another 1.15 million people. And an extra 400,000 have left the labour market altogether since March, which by my calculations is 2.4 million people, adjusted for the labour force, 19%. And you can see that's infinitely higher than what people, the formal unemployment rate would suggest. And that doesn't include all of the potentially up to 900,000 more people who are discouraged or marginally attached, according to the ABS. The government response so far, the first two packages from March overall went 70% of those went to business and 30% went to households by our calculations. That included the doubling of the job seeker payment. The third package was the wage subsidy, which both of these packages that were nominally for workers and households had a lot of veneer of universalism. This is a one payment for all Australians, was the way the JobKeeper payment was framed. But also JobSeeker had some pretty critical exclusions from people on the disability support pension, age pensioners, carers. And the JobKeeper payment was weaponised. It was through using the Fair Work Act. The government was able to work with big employers to make the JobKeeper payment a framework in which wages and conditions could be attacked. Time-bound free childcare came in, and that was the first sector to lose the JobKeeper payment, with huge detrimental impacts to women and their ability to get back to work. And Job Trainer was announced today, staying in the theme of putting job at the front of stuff, which is very good marketing. 350,000 courses in on-demand areas, so like healthcare, manufacturing, as well as the introduction of, or the extension of, the apprentice wage subsidy. It's quite clear when I outlined the scale of this depression level jobs crisis we're having, that 350,000 free or subsidised courses will barely scratch the surface of even young people who are leaving school and looking for pathways into jobs. And of course, these are not jobs, these are just skills and training. So some of the major impacts on work and industries we've seen in this point coming out of this crisis is that there isn't immediately a path to snap back in any of those customer facing sectors, and no plan for what happens to those workers. Aviation and university sectors were centered in the story of the COVID crisis. In many ways, they were staged battles whereby the government sought to completely attack what was left of the public sector aspects of the university system. And the aviation sector, they worked very closely with government to screw over many thousands of aviation workers. We've seen labour market inequalities intensify in this time, and that's based on centering around whether you had a secure job or not, because insecure workers are cheaper to sack and they were the first to go. One of the ways in which this labour market inequality is being intensified is based on the work from home or non-work from home distinction. We worked out that about 30% of the workforce could work from home, and they're more likely to be professional, full-time, permanent university educated workers. And they earn on average 25% more than people who can't work from home. And then you add to that the inequality of insecure work, the fact that people who are going out and leaving their houses to do their jobs don't have paid sick leave. which has become one of the Achilles heel of our fight against this pandemic, is that people are financially penalised for getting sick. And I've noted here the gender pay gap, because I think what we're going to see in this time is actually far more of a difference between women who can work from home and then women who are going out and working in essential jobs. I think that gap in pay is going to be in some ways much greater than that between men and women doing the same type of work. And there are obviously some concerns for this type of work as well, in particular a massive cost shift from capital to labour in packing down offices and forcing employees to set up their own workplaces in their home without any regard for work health and safety or the cost necessarily of running your own office. And so because we are in a place of very diminished power in collective organisation, this has been a big opportunistic push by organised business and a willful government to double down on the attack on wages and conditions that was happening pre-crisis. So we were in already record low wage growth before this pandemic hit. But some of the new attacks have been coming from all over. We've had calls to freeze a national minimum wage and award rates. We've had the attacks on the EAs and how the process in which we can form and make enterprise agreements. Public sector wage cuts at a Commonwealth and state level, which have huge macroeconomic effects, as well as directly attacking predominantly female workers who make up most public sector workers. And then these attacks are coming from these false assumptions and these arguments that by lowering wages, we're somehow going to create or protect jobs. Or that there's shared sacrifice. If we accept that there's some sacrifice to make now, we will resume some normal compensation level at some point after. That's not at all obviously how it works. This is a fight between labour and capital, and labour is not quite organised right. But we do need to prepare for this fight to defend wages, rights and benefits. And I note benefits here because, I'll come back to that, because I don't think there's been a clearer time where the interests of the unemployed and those who have been kicked out of work or long-term unemployed are now very much tied into everything that's happening in the employment space. So whatever space had opened up there over time, I think that's quite clearly an opportunity to close it off. The Australian our friends at the Australian ran this absolute just BS of a story, which had a very relatable bloke called Eddie who owns 3 BPs. And he is struggling to find anyone who will work for his measly 22 hours of minimum wage work a week because it falls below the current job seeker rate. And what we're seeing now is this mounting argument from government and employers that somehow there are these jobs that exist and people are lazy. And of course, this is about building up or lowering expectations about what happens with the job seeker payment and the rate of the job seeker rate, the payment itself. But it's obviously so tied into maintaining low wage labour, because Eddie's problem is that people won't take his shitty job. And this is a position that's good for us. We want to be able to say that the job seeker payment it should force employers like Eddie to actually pay people decent rates. The research that I did into the actual evidence of employers actually having labour shortages found that in this survey that government did, only 3% of employers actually said that they were struggling to find people. And I think if you could look at those 74 firms, they would most certainly be just people like Eddie. So another major area of where we should keep a lookout of this mounting attack on wages and conditions is this back and forth that government's been doing with the union movement in terms of, I think, performing that they are getting along or performing some sort of consensus building. But it's clear to me that these industrial relations working groups he's compiled between business and unions, of which there are 5, you only have to look at the topics of the basis in which people are meeting to know that this is quite clearly an employer agenda. And I've provided some translations from their own to tell you what I think this is about. One group will be looking at weakening wage floors, award simplification is what they will call it. protecting and expanding casual work, in particular overturning the recent federal court decision, which said that if you're in, if an employer is employing you on a regular basis with regular shifts, you are liable to pay them as a permanent employee. Expanding non-union below award EA making. And what they want to do is get rid of the better off overall test, which says that any agreement you form with your workers has to improve upon the minimum wage or the minimum floors. Locking in wages in whole of project EAs. This one's quite terrifying because what it could do potentially is block out the ability of unions to be able to work with, you know, future movements like an environment movement that wanted to shut down a coal mine, for instance. What this agreement could do is lock out the ability of industrial action over the entire life of a coal mine or a gas project, was probably a better example. That's the kind of impact that these industrial relations tools can have. And then I would say the wage theft compliance mechanism is much more about how do we deal with wage theft that doesn't block unions from being able to have a role. So what we have to think about in this time is not to think of this as stimulus, right? This is what we're looking at is the scale of destruction of jobs and the battering of private sector activity is the money that's being pushed into the economy and that will be pushed in is going to have to be a reconstruction effort. Plus, we don't want to stimulate a set of really shitty conditions. We came into this crisis with a whole heap of problems, and the snapback is not desirable for workers, I don't think. We don't want people to go back to work and we don't want them to go out shopping. The goal is obviously to support this temporary shutdown, support incomes from non-market incomes from government to keep flowing, support the work health and safety of workers on the job and the safety of the public more broadly. So this is why we need a COVID-19 reconstruction plan. And as I said at the start, we came out of the 1930s depression after 10 years of stagnation with a very strong, comprehensive, ambitious public-led reconstruction agenda. Obviously, some of our look at that time to kick that off, we had much higher levels of union organisation and civil society organisation. But I think we have to be talking about this because the money's going to be spent. We just have to be building up the forces and the ability to shape the way that happens. So some of the key elements, I think, of this reconstruction plan has to be a commitment to full employment, extending income protection for anyone who needs it, repairing and strengthening our health and skills system, including making them fee-free and centering TAFE back into rebuilding our vet sector and public universities as centre to the tertiary system too. So it's from childcare through to university, it should be free. Sustained public infrastructure investment. We actually have very low levels of infrastructure investment, contrary to the way that it's positioned and demonstrated by politicians. We need to make serious investments in renewable power infrastructure and be able to export that, across diffuse it across our economy and export as well. Non-market housing of huge importance in our totally derelict, high inequality housing market, and a permanent expansion of public services with more direct hiring is going to be very important. It's more that last one that I think we can actually start to make some inroads in now. So if you can follow me with my thinking at this point, because I think that the agenda that has been set for Australia and what's been possible for us and been possible for business has been actually centered around what's happened with the virus. Of course, like this whole crisis is because of the virus. So I've been thinking a lot and listening to the epidemiologists who are saying actually elimination is something that is within reach, within grasp for Australia. And up until this point, the story has always been that the best we can do is try and suppress it. And so what's clearly happened in the last couple of weeks with Victoria is it shows just how sneaky this virus is and just how easily it spreads and how rapidly it spreads, to the point where we've had to, and rightfully, shut down the Victorian economy for a period of 6 weeks. And the fact that it's 6 weeks would suggest that it's 4 weeks for the virus cycle plus 2 weeks to basically nip it in the bud, which would suggest that the state is gunning towards that. And besides New South Wales, which hasn't said we want to eliminate, most states have said we have an interest in elimination. The Commonwealth does not want to. And this is where I think we start thinking about what are the power plays that going on and how do we burst this open and seize the public health ground, I would say. There are very high economic and social costs of shutdown and reboot. Clearly this suppression that mechanism isn't going to work. Neither is the let it rip and herd immunity approach, right? We've seen what's happened in the US and Sweden. They've had similar economic outcomes, sky high unemployment and just way more people dead, right? So we don't want to go down that route, and I don't think Australians would stand for it. Contrary to what Morrison has said today, which is, we can't, yesterday and today, which is we can't eliminate the virus, because that would close us off from the world. Australia is a very trade exposed economy. It's very reliant on importing manufacturers, including 96% of our medical goods. But also that doesn't help us to understand why New Zealand, which is a very similar economy to Australia's, which is it depends on primary good export, it's deindustrialized in the same way, at low productivity, low wage economy. And they are looking at how they can maintain elimination as a strategy. So I think elimination actually provides leverage for organised labour for better jobs, getting control of the skills system and better organisation prospects. I think flare-ups are likely, but it's about focusing our efforts on elimination as the end goal. Because if we're always gunning for elimination, then we're talking about ongoing investments in the public healthcare system, into Medicare, ongoing investments into worker organisation in the workplace, because you have to have very strong work health safety standards to maintain an elimination stance. I think there's a huge discussion to have about what this would look like for the Australian economy. But for starters, we can say those are benefits for organised labour. So why is it that business want to lower expectations that elimination is a possible goal in Australia? So yesterday, they all scrambled behind the Prime Minister to say, Victorian experience shouldn't be seen as a reason to switch to an elimination strategy. That would tank the economy. Rather, we should get to the execution of the suppression strategy right. So this idea that what we're doing now is suppressing, but we are also tanking the economy, so to speak, under this approach. And so you start thinking, why do they want to lower expectations? And I would suggest that it's because they fear what happens with control over the supply of labour, because business is very dependent on cheaper migrant labour, and they don't want to lose control over the work process, because that would diminish their ability to control wages. And I think this is why it's a battleground for us. The other reason why they would like to avoid this, as neoliberals, they don't like any public sector or public good responses. And this is quite clearly a shining light for us. And this is where I get to wave my flag for Medicare, because I think we've taken it for granted that our public health response has come before the economic one. And we've taken it for granted because, the way that we've looked at Morrison's, some liberals would say, well, it's good that he followed the advice of the experts, or the let it rippers are being like, look, he shouldn't have done that. But actually what's happened is that the trust and the belief that public health is important has actually put a barrier to the ability of the let it rippers to let go. And it's also diminished the ability of the neoliberal project to keep pushing. And our success in flattening the curve, I think, actually bought time for them to work out what this snapback or business-led recovery narrative would be. But the Victorian shutdowns, I think, have disrupted that story now. And it's going to be very hard for the government to continue with the austerity narrative and the austerity agenda in terms of, cutting the JobKeeper program right back, cutting JobSeeker. And I think what this shows for me as a proud South Australian, is that states have retained a lot of democratic space, and they are going to be there's going to be significant stoushes, I think, between states and the Commonwealth on how it is we get through these next steps. So one of the clearest, I think, possibilities or strategies that organised labour can take is to be slaying the dragon of precarity. Precarious work is quite clearly the Achilles heel in fighting the pandemic, because we've seen with all of the workplace outbreaks from Newmarch House, Cedar Meats in New South Wales, and now more recently in Victoria with the aged care facilities and the abattoirs. This is the common factor in these workplaces is labour hire and casual work. And it's very difficult to convince the poorest workers without any security in their jobs to stay home when they're feeling a little unwell, if they are financially penalised for doing that. So we have to remove the financial penalty that workers take on, because it's in terms of cost benefit, even like the costs of this outbreak far outweigh what it would cost to deliver secure work to these people. And the reason why we want to deal with precarious work is it's because it's also the Achilles heel of unionisation. It's quite clearly been the strategy of capital to dismantle formal secure jobs, decent benefits, and that security, because when workers are secure, they unionise. When they're insecure, they don't. So I think we can build a labour strategy that focuses on unions becoming leaders in the health response, because lifting the quality and the pay of jobs is critical. And I think what we know is that 1 in 3 workers don't have any paid sick leave, which is where we are not prepared. We don't have the right weapons for this war, if you want to use this term. Consent for virus elimination, climate lifts. Yes, trying to make sense of what I meant here. The other reason why we should take on this campaign or this fight is because the public already want to eliminate the virus. They already want to deal with this. So you've got the public on side about improving the quality of precarious work. The normal churn model of these precarious workplaces, aged care, lots of social services work, childcare, like a lot of the privatised social services depend on high levels of churn, but that churn is going to be too expensive and dangerous for business as well. I've written here Fair Work Commission orientation, not useful, because we applied for paid pandemic leave and they denied it to healthcare workers recently. So clearly we're not going to get any outcomes by going to the commission. We're going to have to build power and organise for it. I'm not sure why there's this love heart appearing on every one of my slides, but we're going to go with it. I'll take it as encouragement. I hear just like some of the really awesome stuff. I think we're starting to see unions start to shift from even just the position of work PPE and work health safety is about, defending the safety of workers. But it's so clear now that workers' health and safety is public health and safety. So the benefits of this sort of strategy is that it ties production to the work health and safety of the infrastructure of work health and safety in the workplace, and then to the public health sector. And then you expand from that, because we want train drivers to be safe, to not be carrying COVID when they're doing their jobs, because we're going to take public transport. But then if that public transport provider is a private provider, then we also have an interest in undermining the cost basis of the private model of how it is that these essential services run, because they often depend on insecure and precarious work in order to make their money. So you can see how they kind of spill over into opening up this space for us to talk about how do we get more services into public hands. And there's a really awesome campaign in the UK called We Own It, which has been building up through the Corbyn period, and I think is making lots of strides now in this COVID environment. And it's the potential for us to look at sectors that have been poor performing privatisations, that have been parasitic on this precarious work and dangerous work for us now, which include aged care, disability work, the vocational education sector, childcare, mental health, social services, employment services, these are all really large employers, and they're also female dominated employers. So they're also, this kind of strategy carries the good jobs framework, which means making jobs more secure and righting the wrongs of the neoliberal period, because these are all privatization experiments in the neoliberal period of essential services. These should be in public hands. And where am I at time-wise? I've got a couple minutes. Ooh, I'm happy about this. So what is the rebuilding public sector and good jobs then going to be about? Well, why don't we target public sector job creation? We only have something like 18% public sector employment. Even like the social democratic countries have upwards of 30 more. So like in terms of framing our campaign demands, we could think of it in this way. We should think about it as undoing the decades of outsourcing damage. I think that COVID can help us by driving a public health safe work agenda. We can actually start to unpick the logic of these social services contracts run by behemoths like Serco, for instance. Like we could build campaigns that take on the big guys. We need more direct employment in planning capability, because in the last few decades, the public sector has been totally smashed. And in part, you can just look at the consultancies and the rise of these other parasites, of which have emptied the knowledge, policy knowledge and capability of our institutions to plan. I think that we should cut all government contracts to consultancies and offer good enough wages to entice all those people out and work for the public service, because they are often ex-public servants anyway. We need to build IT capability, because actually it's going to be really hard to plan for any kind of reconstruction because the sector is also smashed. And I would finish on the importance of public sector unions. I think it's obvious in kind of the strategy I'm putting forward that they would be playing a really important role. But it's about building cross-union and civil society campaigns through them. And imagining that there would be a larger social governance role of unions in planning the delivery of those public goods. So once we take them back into public hands, the people who run those services should also be a part of planning for those services with the community. In conclusion, there are many economic and political dangers at hand, but there are many opportunities for us as well. I think we can link worker rights into a public health response. We can expand the space for the public sector and therefore diminish private control over large sections of our economy. And we can build union capacity to lead redistribution, right? Because it's not just about government spending more, it's about redistribution. We have to always keep that in mind. And we can imagine a new model of growth that is public-led, more democratic, and focused on meeting human needs. Thank you.
That was brilliant. And I'm getting a lot of people saying as much as well. Fantastic presentation. People are saying thank you very, very much for that. It was absolutely full of content, a lot to talk about. We're getting a large number of questions coming through. The first one, which I have, is from Ben Spies Butcher, who I'll just unmute for a second and he can ask it himself.
Hey, first of all, that was absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much. I was really interested in your comments about states, particularly given the Feds seem so unresponsive. But I think we've been used to looking to the Commonwealth because it's got money and states don't have money. And so I'm interested in thinking about the regulatory role of states. What can they do? Potentially their renationalisation role. But also what the limits of, they can't pay for childcare, they can't pay for leave, they can't pay for benefits. So just thinking through, are they a realistic target? Is there something we can do with them there? What do you think?
A huge area of which I have like a lot of interest in. I've been focused on this for a few years because I thought as neoliberalism began to unravel in Australia, there would be more and more tensions between the states and Commonwealth, because the states by constitutional powers are required to deliver welfare state goods like education, healthcare, which are the major ones that I think the institutions are still strong. But like you said, they don't have the revenue raising power. They've got to come to the Commonwealth with their hand out. And this is the way that the Commonwealth has been able to bleed the Medicare system dry is because they've been able to cut, you know, billions of funding out of the healthcare system. I think the main barrier, which will be so interesting to see the way it plays out, is it's political, because the democratic space and the belief in the role of public institutions and government, I think, is held in the states. I think it's been protected there. It's diminished at a federal level. Like, in many ways, I think that people switch off. They don't even relate to the Commonwealth. But that's purely in a political sense. I think in terms of like the tangible ways that states are getting through this, they've spent billions and billions of dollars, and actually provided some of the strongest immediate responses and targeted responses for certain sectors, right? So what I want to do some research into is like, what are those risks that states have taken on with whatever ways that because they've clearly loaned from somewhere. And more broadly, I think it would be good to have a conversation about revenue raising. Like, I'm down for giving states like taxation powers and building campaigns for the Commonwealth to lose some of its own. I think, you know, why not? But look, that's purely because that flows from my political analysis, which is that states have retained more democratic space than the Commonwealth. So therefore, maybe we should double down on that. Or we rebuild a nice, vibrant national campaign to take back our most effective and most powerful layer of government. Sorry, not a direct answer though.
As an old political hack, maybe still a political hack, also mention the fact that Labor wins state government about 60 to 65% of the time, and only wins federal government about 30 to 35% of the time. So concentrating on state government policy has always been a fairly sensible idea. Can
I just say to that as well? That's because when people think that the coalition are economic managers, it's because they give the money to the states and they trust Labor governments to actually provide stuff that they want. And then they assume that because those things are provided, it must be because the coalition has been managing the economy. I think that's the way people think.
That's right. I've got a question here from Jane Flanagan. She says, fantastic presentation. Thanks, Alison. You mentioned a commitment to full employment. How do you define full employment? How are we going to achieve greater labour job security if the Nauru idea remains unchallenged? What about the macroeconomic issues associated with full employment? That is the employment versus inflationary challenges. How do you propose managing this challenge?
Well, I'm a big fan of collective bargaining. I think that centralised collective bargaining, if to the extent that inflation needs to be controlled by labour, I don't actually think that we should always think that, you know, controlling workers' incomes is the way you control inflation. Like, there are many other ways that we can do that. So I guess in that sense, I would reject the idea that we have to accept that that there's some you know, we can tinker with whatever workers do, and therefore that will control prices. So the question is, how do we get to full employment? Well, I think we do that by forcing investment. Some of the reasons why I made the point of saying it's not just about government spending money to, you know, invest to create direct employment, or working to bring private sector to the table to create jobs. The reason why I say it's about redistribution as well is because I think that there are a very small number of very powerful monopolised sectors of capital in Australia, and many of them are foreign owned. And we're not going to be able to deal with what has been a long-term economic and a parasitic economic and political force in Australia without a program to redistribute wealth and redistribute power. And so for me, full employment is about empowering the ability of organised labour to force investment, and as well as executing their power at a high level in government as well. Full employment is a job available for anyone who's wanting to get one. I don't believe that, I don't subscribe to any of like the buffer unemployment stocks concepts. I think that we can expand public employment, and those jobs can be good union jobs whereby people can organise to improve their wages and conditions. And that we build the power of workers in the private sector to, improve. For instance, if the private sector workers in a manufacturing plant, if they have more bargaining power, they can raise the rate of their wages to the point where that employer has to invest in, better technologies, more efficient ways of doing things, or invest in more jobs. Like if workers have more control at the site of production, they can actually increase employment as well. So, I mean, they're only like small aspects of a full employment agenda, but it's a full employment agenda is one in which you build the capacity of the public sector to force private sector investment and maintain an environment whereby there are ample jobs and lots of like options, right? And ability of workers to move in between jobs. So it's about having a good skill system whereby if a worker didn't like that job and they wanted to move into something else, they could access free education and skills to be able to, retrain. So it's about the spaces in between, as well as the overall existence of, sufficient jobs at sufficient wages.
We've got a couple of questions about the recent skills announcement, actually. Now you mentioned that. So Don Sutherland, who had to leave, give his apologies, wanted to ask specifically that the job trainer announcement puts forward $500 million, but this follows, he's been told this follows $2 to $3 billion of cuts from TAFE over the past 3 years. He wanted to know whether that's correct, whether you agree with that analysis. And Tim Diamond asks, job trainer seems to assume that if we train more people in particular skills and occupations, they will gain employment without any steps taken to create actual jobs that use those skills. Is there any evidence that supply creates demand for skills?
No, we're in a depression level jobs crisis. Like I think we have to, when government try to say we're going to create a skills program, which they did for young people, they created something like 25,000 subsidized uni courses, like a really small amount early in the crisis. And they said, this is our response to youth unemployment. We'll let you study in key areas of high demand. But it doesn't, some of the areas they identify as high demand are nursing and teaching, but that doesn't help us to understand why there are thousands of graduates in both nursing and teaching who don't have jobs. And that's because the healthcare and education systems are severely underfunded. So no, we are in a demand crisis. There are millions of people who are hungry for work and have the capacity to work. There is no supply problem here. I would suggest there's clear issues with pathways into jobs, and if those high demand areas are spaces like healthcare and education, then it's up to government to actually invest in those jobs. I think the 350,000 positions that was announced in Job Train today falls very short of the demand, as I outlined in the presentation. I think that will barely scratch the surface of young people who are graduating from high school this year. You're muted.
Next question is from our comrade Tamara Ryan. Tamara?
Hi. Yeah, I was just wondering, in the way forward, Ali, do you think there's a place for shifting that pay gap between genders and the classes of women, like you said, by campaigning for investment in social infrastructure, especially in those towns and areas where the unsustainable resource extraction, like male-dominated, will at least hopefully start to be phased out?
Just to confirm, Tamara, are you asking, will investing in social services in areas that have like high extraction industries help to deal with the gender pay gap?
Yeah, and kind of with this like whole rebuilding of society and yeah, combining like the gender pay gap and the like climate crisis and everything.
Yeah, absolutely. I think expanding public services and direct public employment will be a really critical way of transitioning out of the extractive industries. I think that some of the main ways that women are being affected is not just like they've been more likely to lose their jobs in this time and lose hours, but I think that on the women front, and I know that in my talk, it was prefaced, I would talk about the gender stuff, and I didn't get time to do it. But I think free childcare is of really, really high importance, because we've seen in this crisis, when this floor has been completely ripped out, we've seen a complete upheaval of decades of progress of women's access to paid work, and a shift back into like very conservative gender roles again, which has been reinforced by the fact that obviously women have been more likely to lose their jobs, but they get paid less, right? So when you're making a decision in a family about who's going to look after kids, the person who gets paid less is going to do that, and it's women. So I think definitely, Tamara, investment in public services is going to be a big part of the gender pay gap question, but also empowering women workers in those industries to lead their own struggles and to be able to fight for higher wages. That's going to help to force that question of investment, right? Because their wages are kept low by these pernicious private sector contracts, which depend on women working for pittance. So it's about busting that open, and that's kind of what I'm trying to make the argument for in this presentation, is how COVID can help us, I think, to do that. And women workers would be central, I think, in this strategy as well.
Great question. Thanks for the answer. Our next question is from AMWU New South Wales State Secretary Steve Murphy.
G'day.
Okay, Alison, that was very impressive. I like that whole presentation. At the early onset, you kind of said that 70% of the government support was there to protect the interest of private capital, with only around 30%, probably less than that, going to support the interest of working class people. Just a question for you is, in terms of a progressive post-COVID response, what are the basics that we need to make sure are in place to ensure that the costs of this pandemic is not continue to be passed on to working class people?
Well, I mean, I think unionisation is of such high importance now, because that redistribution question, if we don't have the capacity, like organisations with the capacity of people to change the status quo in some way, what we're going to see is just like the most epic level bailout of capital that's ever existed, right? It'll be like the GFC, squared. And the reason why the GFC was a big bailout, where the losses were socialized by the people, and then, the gains, whenever things get better, then those are only taken by people at the top, right? These are distribution questions. How do we stop people as, let's say the bailout happens, how do we position people to share in the rewards, to share in the good times? And, you need, at this point, I can't see a direct route, because I think it's a lot to do with the way I diagnose the failures or the problems of the ALP, which is it's a political wing of an industrial movement, right? So if the industrial movement has declined, then we can't look to the political wing. It was only ever a manifestation of our power at the bottom. So I think our solutions have to come through organised workers. I think that strategically, there are some pretty massive challenges for Australian workers, namely just the kind of power that big resources and mining capital wields over our economy and our politics is so big, right? They will roll democratic elected prime ministers to get their way. And I think that the scale of the challenge, we are in many ways a colony, I'm getting at, right? We're still emerging out of this colonial status. And so building up the capacity of redistribution and so the workers share in the good times and can actually get control of their industries. It means building up industries, because mining has hollowed us out. It's just taken what it wants and what we've got. Thank God we've got public services, but they completely smashed our manufacturing sector, right? And they didn't give a shit. In fact, they cheered it on because those people were unionized and had collective agreement. So building up our power means building up our industries again, the ones that we want and need, that will give workers a decent jobs and produce stuff that we think is important. But it's also about creating the mechanism so that workers have enough strength to share in the good times and be able to shape what those industries look like as well.
Thank you. I've got a question. We've got so many questions coming through and we always run out of time, but I've got a question from Therese Doyle, specifically about to what extent will the situation in Victoria provide openings for unionisation of casualised workers based on what has happened to them?
Well, so the lockdowns have, I think what we'll see next jobs figures are another wave of unemployment, and it'll be those casual workers. I think that sectors that have high levels of casualisation are often those customer-facing private sector services that have been shut down. And I do actually, I don't feel confident for workers in those industries because these are low margin, low productivity firms that don't have any support, and they depend on low wages to survive. And they depend on people being able to go in there and spend money, which they can't do. So I think we need to have a plan for casual workers who have come out of those sectors, who are most often young people as well. But in terms of casual workers, you know, I think what I've tried to outline in this presentation is like we can identify parts of the economy where essential workers, where we now acknowledge these people as doing essential tasks like cleaning, retail work, food production, you know, security. There are a whole heap of jobs now that have been revealed as the most essential to keeping the economy going, and they're most likely to be casual jobs. So it's about, you know, linking a public health response to defending the conditions of those workers. And I guess what I'm suggesting is that they actually have leverage. They do have bargaining power because the Australian public want them to be working in a safe way that's going to keep them safe. So, you know, if we are able to organise campaigns around the safety and security of jobs that the rest of the public want to be safe for them as well, I think that's kind of our best route out of this. So it's what I'm putting forward, I think, as I said, this was all a work in progress. It's about shifting our strategies less to the standard industrial, like workers versus capital in the single workplace kind of thinking. It's like we need to be expanding our leverage and building power across organised labour and broader civil society as well.
I know a lot of our older members like Tom McDonald would be particularly appreciative of that kind of analysis and that kind of strategy. We are getting very close to the end of the time. Thank you for everyone for all the questions. I think we've got time for just a couple more. One which came through on email from our comrade Richard Archer. There are plenty of solutions to the economic crisis which has been accelerated by COVID-19, but little direct mention of capitalism, particularly the current debt-fueled version using the financial sector. We now have record levels of debt here and overseas. How do we create the hundreds of thousands of good, secure jobs we need in this situation? Tax, borrow, print money? Will we need to nationalise the banks? How do you fund it all? Alison, what do you think?
Wow, that's a big question. Well, on the banks, yes, let's nationalise the banks, of course. But I think what's interesting in this time is banks, the private banks have lost their monopoly over credit provision because the central bank has kind of stepped in and played a pretty integral role through like quantitative easing. So it's actually the extent of the private banks' control is really like the mortgage market is a massive money maker for them. They kind of depend on the continued asset price increase of houses, which we know is unsustainable. Like how many people are being locked out of the housing market, and there are people clocking, you know, 20, 30 investment properties. The whole housing system and housing finance system is linked into our private banks, and they are, you know, they're very monopolized, very powerful, large national organizations. And they have been wielding a pretty significant campaign to bring down superannuation and get their mitts on that, which I didn't get to talk about, but I think that's because they can see that their portfolio is not diversified enough and they want to come after workers' money. But yes, I think Australians would be down for like nationalising banks. You know, I think if we can just find a way to get away around the old communist tropes, then I'm sure we'll find a way to show it's in public interest, like credit provision is a public good. But like I said, central bank has stepped into that role. So that was where I know we're running out of time, and I just went on a big tangent about banking, but it's just because it was the end of that question. So yes, for governments to fund the kind of COVID reconstruction plan that I was outlining would require, yes, they would have to tax, because I do think we do need to redistribute wealth, but we don't need to redistribute wealth in order to pay for things. And I know my MMT friends will be sighing. There's some relief there, I can feel. But I do think redistribution is important. And the way that they're funding at the moment is through the central bank. I'd like to see the central bank actually play a more direct role in investing in the economy, which they clearly can do. And essentially the central bank is becoming this kind of like the largest shareholder of capitalism, right? It's operating in the interests of maintaining the current conditions. So I think when we can shift the balance of power, then that would be an interesting discussion about what happens with the central bank. I think I'll leave it there. Is that okay?
Of course, and I know it's getting very, very close to time, but I will, if it's all right, get one last question in from Roger Markwick, who is using Therese Doyle's link. Go ahead, Roger, you got the last question.
Just very quickly. So I was very interested in the point that you made earlier in the piece that and the elimination strategy in terms of the pandemic could actually facilitate the strengthening of the hand of the public sector and the labour movement, and that conversely, therefore, Morrison et al. Prefer the suppression tactic, because that opens the way to capital and so forth to weaken the hand of the labour movement, and so forth. So on that basis, I just wondered whether, in fact, the New Zealand's seeming success with an elimination strategy has achieved, or seems to be achieving, the kinds of aspirations that you have put on the table. That is, strengthening of the labour movement, strengthening of the public sector as a way out of, the current economic crisis.
Absolutely. What's happening in New Zealand is a problem for Australian capitalism and for the current government. I think if we can look over our shoulder at this example, it's going to continually sit on their shoulder and breathe down their necks, because it's an example of an economy that, you know, we have a much larger population, but as I said in the presentation, we have similar economic conditions. And if an economy like New Zealand, which is also trade exposed, is able to prosecute this strategy, it's going to fly in the face of what we're being told, which is that we have to accept that COVID-19 will be part of our lives and death will be part of our lives. I think what's happened in New Zealand, Ardern's been paving the way for this sort of higher wage, higher productivity, public investment economy for a couple of years now. She's been in a coalition government building towards this. And I think she's really doubled down on her popularity in this crisis. And elimination is going to actually just build into the current agenda, or the strategy, I think, that they're running, that New Zealand Labor are running. And I think that employers are on board, because if you look at some of the policies that they're floating now in New Zealand, it's stuff like the 4-day work week. And it's on the basis that they need workers to have enough money and also enough time to travel around their country to be able to boost their tourism business, tourism economy. Because international tourism was a big part of New Zealand's economy. If they go for elimination, they need to be able to give people a quality of life and lift wages to such a level that allows people to rebuild their domestic industries. So I think New Zealand will continue to be a really interesting example for us. I would like to see, we are very dependent on international manufacturers, but I'd like to see a really strong strategy in Australia to rebuild a domestic manufacturing sector on the same sort of basis, right? Because it's going to cost a lot to quarantine all goods as they come into the country too. So there's a cost benefit to it.
John Quiggin, who did one of these presentations, and people can find that on our YouTube channel, was floating the idea of a 9-day fortnight as a start to the 4-day work week on Twitter today. I encourage people to check out his presentation. It's 7:03. Alison's had a very, very long day. I want to thank her hugely for being here for us and putting together that presentation. People can now send Alison messages via the chat, send each other messages via the chat, post links, whatever you want to do. I have to give a plug. Alison is going to be at the launch of the Living Income for Everybody event on the 21st of July, I believe. Is that right, Alison? I haven't dropped you in it. You've actually said yes to that.
Yeah, I did, but I don't know exactly when it is. I can tell you.
All right, we'll post a link to it in the chat section and also on our Facebook page. So huge thank you to Alison for being there. After I give Alison the final word, we will play a song as promised. People may not know that Alison isn't just a political economist of some note, but actually also a talented singer. And so this song has been chosen by her. It's Vince Jones, If I Had a Hammer. So during that, you can message each other, talk to each other, send Alison a message. And I want to thank her again. Thank everyone for being there tonight. And please like the Facebook page and keep an eye out for our upcoming events. We'll have more to announce in the coming weeks. Thank you again, Alison.
Oh, I have nothing else to add, other than I hope you enjoy the sultry sounds of Vince Jones, who's a lad from Wollongong. He's not a lad, he's probably like 60 or so now. And I just love him, and I think you'll enjoy it. It's his take on If I Had a Hammer. If you like jazz, you're going to love it. And thanks for joining me tonight and coming on this little wacky journey and thought exercise with me. I think it worked out in the end. So keep a lookout for our work at the Centre for Future Work, which is where I work.
Brilliant.
Thank you, comrades.
Thank you so much. It's great. And here it is, If I Had a Hammer by Vince Jones. Stay on the line if you like, and swap messages, and we'll see you at the next one. Thank you so much.